Imagine just for a second the sheer chaos of trying to organize billions of diverse organisms on Earth into neat, logical little boxes. I mean, where to even start, right? How exactly do you group a towering redwood tree, a microscopic bacteria, and say the mushroom growing in your backyard? Well, welcome to today's explainer. We're going to unpack the fascinating world of biological classification and the five kingdoms of life. I am honestly so excited to guide you through this because the way we categorize life isn't just some boring list of names. It's literally the story of how our understanding of the natural world has evolved. So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the two-kingdom problem, then look at Whittaker's solution. After that, we'll dive straight into Monera, Protista, and fungi, before finally wrapping up with the rule breakers. All right, section 1, the two-kingdom problem, when biology outgrew its boxes. Okay, let's dive right into this by exploring the early days of classification, because we had some massive, glaring issues with our initial attempts to categorize life on this planet. To really understand the problem, let's trace it back. Way back in the 4th century BC, Aristotle started with pretty simple visual observations. He looked at plants and divided them into trees, shrubs, and herbs. And for animals, he literally just split them into those with red blood and those without. Fast forward a bit to the 18th century, and Carolus Linnaeus created the two-kingdom system, Plantae and Animalia, plants and animals. That was the whole shebang. And incredibly, this super limited system was used all the way up until 1969, when R.H. Whittaker finally proposed a modern breakthrough. Now, the tension here was pretty wild, because that two-kingdom system had massive blind spots. It grouped organisms together that had absolutely nothing in common at a cellular level. It completely missed the critical distinction between eukaryotes, which have a defined nucleus, and prokaryotes, which don't. It just lumped single-celled organisms right in with complex multicellular ones. And it totally ignored whether an organism made its own food, autotrophic, or consumed other things, heterotrophic. Organisms like bacteria and fungi simply didn't fit into Linnaeus's rigid plant or animal boxes. Fungi, for instance, were treated like plants, even though they don't even photosynthesize. Which brings us to section 2, Whittaker's solution, the five-kingdom classification. Enter the hero of our story, R.H. Whittaker. In 1969, he proposed an incredibly elegant solution to all this taxonomic chaos. And Whittaker didn't just guess here. He used 5 precise, logical criteria to fundamentally divide life on Earth. He looked at cell structure, body organization, mode of nutrition, reproduction, and phylogenetic or evolutionary relationships. By applying these really strict rules, the blurry lines suddenly became crystal clear. And that gave us the 5 kingdoms we study today: Monera, Protista, fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. By separating out the organisms that just didn't fit, biology finally had a logical filing system. Now, for the rest of this explainer, we're going to focus our attention entirely on the microscopic, hidden, and honestly often misunderstood first 3 kingdoms on this list. So let's jump straight into section 3, Monera, the prokaryotic pioneers. This is the kingdom of the absolute simplest unicellular organisms on the planet, primarily bacteria and cyanobacteria. But before we go any further, let's clarify a really vital term: prokaryotic. Being prokaryotic is the defining characteristic that separates Monera from every other kingdom we're going to discuss today. A prokaryotic cell has no true nucleus, and it lacks membrane-bound organelles. Its genetic material, its DNA, isn't locked away in some neat little vault. It's just diffused straight throughout the cytoplasm. And most of these organisms reproduce really simply and asexually through binary fission, where one cell literally just splits into 2 identical cells. And the incredible resilience within Monera is just mind-blowing. Take Archaeobacteria, a really special group within this kingdom. They survive in the absolute most extreme hostile environments on Earth, places where nothing else could possibly live. We've got halophiles, which actually thrive in highly concentrated, incredibly harsh salty areas. And then there are methanogens, which live in places like the guts of cows or in marshy areas, producing methane or biogas as a natural byproduct. I mean, they are absolute survivors. Moving right along to section 4, Protista, the diverse eukaryotes. So if Monera is the kingdom of simple bacteria, Protista is essentially biology's junk drawer. It's just filled with diverse, highly complex eukaryotes. Unlike Monera, they actually do have a true nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Take their mode of nutrition, for example. You'll hear the term mixotrophic. Some protists possess this literal superpower to behave as both an autotroph and a heterotroph. A completely fascinating example of this is the euglenoid. Euglenoids lack a rigid cell wall, but instead they have this flexible protein layer called a pellicle. In the sunlight, they use their chlorophyll to photosynthesize, just like a plant, but plunge them into darkness and they totally switch modes. They swim around using their whip-like flagella to actively hunt and consume other organisms, just like an animal. And protists have a massive real-world impact, which becomes super obvious when we contrast a few of them. On one hand, you have diatoms. These are single-celled algae with beautiful, intricate cell walls made of indestructible silica. It's essentially glass. When they die, these shells pile up on the ocean floor over millions of years to form diatomaceous earth, which we actually use in everything from water filters to polishing toothpaste. But on the flip side, we have dinoflagellates. When these guys multiply too rapidly, they cause what we call red tides in the ocean. They release potent toxins that can kill massive amounts of fish and marine life. So microscopic, yeah, but immensely powerful? Absolutely. All right, on to Section 5, fungi, the great decomposers.
This kingdom finally gives mushrooms, molds, and yeasts their own well-deserved spotlight. For centuries, fungi were just grouped in with plants, but Whittaker finally kicked them out. Why? Well, because plants make their own food, fungi definitely do not. They are heterotrophic saprophytes. That's a fancy way of saying they're decomposers. They secrete enzymes to break down dead organic matter and then absorb the nutrients. Plus, a plant's cell wall is made of cellulose, right? But a fungus's cell wall is made of an incredibly tough substance called chitin. They just operate on a completely different chemical and biological level. So, if we break down the 4 main fungi classes, we can really see how differently they eat and reproduce. First, we've got phycomycetes, like your standard bread molds, which live on decaying matter, or act as parasites, and they reproduce through zoospores, or zygotes. Then there are ascomycetes, which form spores in these little sac-like structures. Basidiomycetes include the typical mushrooms you're probably picturing right now. They act as massive saprotrophic decomposers in our ecosystems and reproduce via basidiospores. And finally, we have the deuteromycetes. These are often called the imperfect fungi. And why is that? Because they only reproduce asexually. A sexual reproduction stage has literally never been observed by scientists. Finally, we reach Section 6, the rule breakers, entities defying classification. Because nature just absolutely loves to throw us a curveball, there are mysterious entities out there that still completely defy Whittaker's 5-kingdom system. They just don't fit anywhere. I want you to consider this massive paradox in biological taxonomy. Are viruses living, or are they non-living? When you really weigh their traits, you can see exactly why viruses don't fit into Monera, Protista, fungi, or anywhere else. They literally blur the line between biology and chemistry. On the living side, sure, they have genetic material, DNA or RNA, they can mutate, and they certainly reproduce, as we all know from catching a common cold. But consider their non-living traits. They aren't composed of cells. They have absolutely no metabolism of their own. Outside a host body, they cannot replicate at all. You can literally crystallize them and store them in a drawer like a chemical. Because they lack a true cellular structure, Whittaker just couldn't give them a kingdom. And if you think viruses are weird, contrast them with viroids. A virus at least has its genetic material protected inside a protein coat called a capsid. But a viroid? It strips the entire concept of an infectious agent down to its absolute bare minimum. Viroids are way smaller than viruses, they have 0 protein coat, and they consist solely of a naked strand of RNA. But despite that simplicity, they are highly infectious, primarily causing diseases that can absolutely devastate agricultural crops. And we can't forget lichens. A lichen isn't even a single organism. It's a brilliant tag-team survival strategy. It's a symbiotic association between algae, the phycobiont, which acts like a tiny solar panel producing food, and fungi, the mycobiont, which acts as the structural house providing shelter and absorbing water. Together, they form something entirely new. And as a bonus, they're incredible bioindicators, meaning they simply will not grow in polluted environments. Which brings us to the end of our explainer. From Aristotle's simple trees and bloodless animals to Whittaker's elegant 5 kingdoms, our need to organize the natural world has driven some truly incredible scientific discovery. But, as viruses and viroids clearly prove, the definition of life is still blurring. So I'll leave you with this. What undiscovered microscopic rule breakers are out there right now, waiting in the deep oceans or extreme environments that might force us to rewrite the kingdoms of life all over again? Keep questioning, keep observing, and thanks so much for joining me to unpack the brilliant, chaotic classification of life.